It was on a September evening in 1977, in her quiet Paris apartment, that Maria Callas was found lifeless, the curtains half drawn against the fading daylight, the city sounds muffled, and the world stunned that the voice which once set theaters ablaze had fallen into silence. Welcome, dear listener, to this circle of remembrance. I invite you to share in the comments when and where you are listening so that our voices may weave together across continents and time. Do not forget to subscribe, that this journey through memory may endure and continue its song. There are stories that rise like music, swelling from faint beginnings to commanding crescendos, only to dissolve once more into silence. The story of Maria Callas, remembered as La Divina, is such a story. A woman of immense gifts whose voice could pierce the air like a blade or caress it like a sigh. She lived not in the calm of balance, but in storms of passion, ambition, rivalry, and heartbreak. Her life, like her art, was never a gentle tale of harmony, but a relentless struggle between glory and despair. To begin her journey, we must return not to the grand stages of Milan or Paris, but to a cramped apartment in New York City, where in 1923 a child was born to Greek immigrants, and where shadows shaped her before she ever knew the radiance of applause. The city of New York in those years was a place of restless energy, crowded tenements and the smell of coal and food rising together in the streets. In one of those apartments, Maria Callas entered the world, a child neither planned nor warmly welcomed by her mother. Evangelia, her mother, longed for beauty, refinement, and wealth, and she looked upon her youngest daughter not with softness, but with expectation, as if the infant were already a vessel to carry unfulfilled dreams. Her father, George, was a gentle man, a pharmacist by trade, who had crossed oceans seeking opportunity, yet he found himself overwhelmed by the harshness of his wife and the struggles of immigrant life. In this uneasy household, Maria's childhood was marked not by ease, but by a strange duality, neglect mixed with relentless demand. Evangelia was harsh, sometimes cruel, yet she recognized something unusual in her daughter's voice. She forced Maria to sing for visitors, to perform for family, as if the child's only worth was in her ability to entertain. In such early coercion, one might sense the root of her later torment. Her art was never entirely her own, but something others demanded, something extracted. Still, the voice grew. Even as a child, Maria's sound was not a sweet chirp like other girls', but something larger, darker, mature beyond her years. It startled listeners. Imagine a little girl standing in a small apartment, her voice cutting through the noise of the street outside, echoing against the walls, filling space too narrow to contain it. Such was the beginning of La Divina, not yet divine, but already carrying a storm inside her lungs. Yet the house was no sanctuary. Her mother compared her constantly to her elder sister, Jackie, who was slender, delicate, and better loved. Maria was heavy-set, awkward, bespectacled, a child of appetite and intensity. She was made to feel clumsy, unattractive, and unworthy. These early wounds never healed, and throughout her life, even when thousands wept at her performances, she carried inside the voice of her mother, whispering that she was not enough. How strange that a woman who would command emperors and magnates was never free from the judgment of one small apartment in New York. But even in this harsh upbringing, there was resilience. When her mother's demands became unbearable, Maria sought escape in music. She would sit alone, humming to herself, shaping notes like companions. While other children played in the street, she found play within melodies, as though the music itself became her only true friend. Such solitude forged not only her artistry, but also her hunger for approval, for she learned that applause could substitute for affection, that ovations might drown out loneliness. As the years passed, the Callas household grew more fractured. Her parents' marriage faltered, her father drank more heavily, her mother more bitter. Yet through the cracks, Maria's voice only became stronger, more disciplined. She listened to recordings of great sopranos and tried to imitate them, yet her voice always carried something raw, unpolished, too powerful to be confined to imitation. Some would later say it was imperfect, even ugly at times, yet this imperfection was its truth. It was a voice of struggle, of survival, born in hunger and longing. By the late 1930s, the family faced another upheaval. Evangelia decided to return to Greece with her daughters, seeking stability in a homeland now shadowed by political turmoil. For Maria, this move was both an exile and a liberation. She left behind the crowded streets of New York, but she also left behind the possibility of anonymity. In Athens, her talent would be noticed, cultivated, and demanded with new intensity. But before we follow her across the Atlantic, let us pause here, at the edge of her American childhood. Picture the young girl, spectacles slipping down her nose, singing in a dim apartment where her voice is both a burden and a blessing. She does not yet know the stages of Milan, the luxury yachts of Onassis, or the cruel glare of newspapers. She knows only the sound of her own voice filling the darkness, perhaps comforting herself as much as those who listened. And so we end the first part of this journey with that echo, a child's song, bouncing against walls that could not contain it. Was it the voice of freedom or the cry of captivity? Perhaps it was both, as so many things in her life would be. The child's song that once echoed against the cramped walls of a New York apartment did not vanish, but seemed to travel with her across the ocean, carried by the restless waves as her family made their way back to Greece. The journey was not one of triumph, but of displacement. Evangelia had grown weary of life in America, of a husband she no longer loved, of the sense of anonymity that dulled her ambitions. She sought in the old country a return to roots, to familiarity, to a place where she might mold her daughters into something grander than what New York had offered. For Maria, the journey was bewildering. The smell of salt air heavy on the ship, the deck creaking beneath her feet as the skyline of New York dissolved into distance and the uncertain shores of Europe grew nearer. Athens in the late 1930s was a city of contradictions. The white stones of its ancient ruins gleamed under the Mediterranean sun, reminders of a glory long past, yet the streets of the modern city were crowded with poverty, political unrest, and whispers of approaching war. For a young girl arriving from the United States, it was at once a return and an estrangement. She was Greek, yes, but also foreign, carrying an accent, habits, and an awkwardness that marked her as different. Yet it was in this soil, amid turmoil and hunger, that her gift would begin to flourish in earnest. Evangelia, still determined that Maria should be the vessel of her ambitions, enrolled her in the Athens Conservatoire, where the stern discipline of classical training awaited. It was there that Maria came under the guidance of Elvira de Hidalgo, a Spanish soprano, whose name had once been praised across Europe. De Hidalgo recognized in the awkward teenager something extraordinary, not just a powerful voice, but a natural instinct for drama, for embodying the tragic heroines of opera as if their fates were her own. Under de Hidalgo's tutelage, Maria learned the bel canto tradition, the art of shaping sound with clarity, agility, and emotional depth. The lessons were rigorous, hours upon hours spent repeating scales, mastering phrasing, controlling the immense force of her voice. De Hidalgo was demanding but not cruel. Unlike her mother, she saw Maria not as an extension of herself, but as an artist in her own right, though one who required fierce discipline. To Maria, these lessons were a revelation. At last, her voice was not a burden imposed by family, but a craft that could be honed, a path that might lead her out of the shadows. Yet these years in Athens were far from easy. The world was on the brink of war, and soon Greece itself was caught in the devastating grip of occupation. In 1941, German forces entered Athens, and the city descended into a darkness that tested every inhabitant. Hunger became a daily companion. Food was scarce. People bartered scraps of bread, and famine claimed thousands. For Maria and her family, survival meant sacrifice, endurance, and, strangely, music. It is said that during those bleak years, Maria continued to sing, not on grand stages, but in whatever spaces were available. The sound of her voice soaring above the despair of occupation was like a stubborn flame refusing to be extinguished. There is an image that lingers from this time. The young soprano standing in a dim hall, the windows blacked out for fear of bombings, her audience clutching coats against the cold, yet for a moment transported by the sound of her voice into a world beyond hunger and fear. Was she already aware of the power she held, the ability to lift others out of their suffering even as she carried her own? Or was she merely clinging to the only certainty she knew, the discipline of music as a lifeline in the chaos? These years etched resilience into her being. The deprivation that gnawed at her body also carved deeper channels in her soul, making her art something more than decoration. It became survival, necessity. One cannot listen to her later performances of roles such as Norma or Medea without hearing the imprint of these years, the rawness, the urgency, the sense that every note is pulled from a place where life and death meet. Unlike singers who grew in comfort, Maria's art was baptized in hunger, sharpened by loss, sustained by will. Even as Athens struggled under the weight of war, opportunities appeared for the young soprano. By 1941, she made her official debut in Tosca, taking on a role that would remain forever linked with her name. Those who were present spoke of the strange authority she projected, even as a teenager. The stage lights revealed not a child, but a woman of imposing presence, her voice filling the theater with a weight that seemed disproportionate to her age. Critics and audiences alike were struck by the paradox. How could someone so young embody despair and passion with such authenticity? Perhaps it was because she had lived close enough to both. As the war dragged on, Maria continued to perform, gaining roles in the Greek National Opera and building a reputation that spread beyond the starving city. Yet these years also deepened her estrangement from her mother. Evangelia's control grew harsher, her demands more unreasonable, as if she wished to consume her daughter's success as her own. Maria, though still bound by filial duty, began to resist, her inner defiance simmering beneath outward obedience. The wounds of this relationship would mark her forever, even as her voice soared to greater heights. When the war finally ended, Athens emerged battered, its people scarred but unbroken. For Maria, the city had been both cradle and crucible. It had given her discipline, resilience, and her first taste of recognition. Yet it had also taught her the loneliness of being set apart, the burden of being used, the weight of carrying a gift too large for ordinary life. She was not yet La Divina, but she was no longer merely the awkward girl from New York. She had become an artist shaped by shadows and fire. And so, as Europe slowly rebuilt itself in the late 1940s, Maria faced another turning point. Opportunities called her back across the seas, to lands where opera houses had not fallen silent, where careers could be made or broken on a single performance. She would leave Athens with its scars and its memories, carrying within her the sound of air raid sirens mingling with applause, the taste of hunger mingled with the sweetness of ovation. Let us pause on this threshold. The young singer, standing in Athens, the war newly ended, her eyes fixed on horizons yet unseen. Around her, the ruins of an ancient city whisper of past glory and resilience. Within her, the voice that once consoled a starving nation now yearns for stages greater still. She does not yet know the triumphs and betrayals awaiting her, but she carries forward the stubborn flame that refused to die, even in famine. And as we leave her there, In the city of stone and sun, we hear again that faint echo of her song. No longer the child's cry in a New York apartment, but a fuller, fiercer voice, resonating against marble halls and darkened skies. It lingers still, as if waiting to be carried once more across the sea, toward a destiny that will demand everything she has to give. The voice that once rang out through the marble halls of Athens did not fade when the war ended. It deepened, hardened, and began to burn with new fire. In the weary city where hunger and silence had reigned, Maria Callas found herself stepping onto stages that were both fragile and luminous, spaces where her gift could unfurl in the presence of audiences starved not only for bread, but for beauty. It was in these early post-war years that her flame was first kindled into something that the world could not ignore. Athens, still marked by ruins both ancient and recent, offered little in terms of wealth or stability, yet it offered Maria something greater, the chance to prove herself before an audience that had endured suffering and knew instinctively when truth was being sung. The Greek National Opera, modest though it was compared to La Scala or the Met, became her proving ground. She was still barely 20, yet she took on roles that seasoned singers approached with caution. Tosca, Santuzza in Cavalleria Rusticana, Leonore in Fidelio. Each demanded not only vocal power, but an instinct for drama, for inhabiting characters whose lives are torn by passion and fate. Those who were there spoke of a presence that startled them. It was not merely the sound of her voice, though that alone could overwhelm a hall. It was the way she seemed to become, the figure she portrayed. When she sang Tosca, it was not a young woman imitating a tragic heroine. It was Tosca herself, fearful, proud, desperate, living before their eyes. Critics found themselves struggling for words, for how could they describe a voice so vast in color, capable of soaring one moment and breaking the next into a near whisper, like glass about to shatter? To some ears, it was not always beautiful in the conventional sense. Yet beauty was not its purpose. The voice carried truth, raw and unsettling, as though it revealed not only the music, but the very soul of the singer. Maria herself seemed to thrive on this collision between imperfection and power. She was no longer the awkward girl mocked for her appearance. On stage, she commanded authority that could silence doubt. Yet off stage, her insecurities lingered, sharpened by her mother's comparisons and the gossip of others. She was large, bespectacled, and far from the graceful image of an opera star. Even as applause thundered, she felt the sting of being judged by appearances rather than by sound. This tension between the adored diva on stage and the vulnerable woman off stage would haunt her throughout her life, fueling both her artistry and her despair. In these years, she also faced choices that revealed the shape of her ambition. Offers began to reach her from abroad, yet they were uncertain, precarious. To leave Greece so soon after the war was no small matter, yet she understood instinctively that her destiny could not be confined to Athens. The hunger for greatness, already alive in her, demanded stages that could challenge her fully. And so, when the chance arose to return to America in search of opportunities, she set sail once more, leaving behind the city that had tested her resilience. Yet America did not open its arms easily. Despite her talent, she faced rejection. Auditions in New York left her disheartened. The Metropolitan Opera, bastion of prestige, did not immediately recognize her value. Perhaps her appearance worked against her, or perhaps her dramatic, forceful style seemed at odds with the smoother, more polished preferences of the time. Whatever the reason, the path to success was not straightforward. She found herself once again on the margins, her brilliance unacknowledged, her future uncertain. It was Italy rather than America that would finally ignite her career. Fate led her to Verona, where she was offered a role in La Gioconda. The production was modest, yet it became a turning point. Here at last her voice was heard by those who would recognize its singularity. Among them was Giovanni Battista Meneghini, a wealthy industrialist who would later become her husband, and more importantly, figures within the Italian operatic world who sensed that this young Greek soprano possessed something rare. From Verona, opportunities multiplied. Soon she was invited to sing in Florence and then Milan, the heart of Italian opera. At La Scala, she would find both her triumphs and her trials, but in these early performances, the fire was first glimpsed, the promise of a singer who could change the very way audiences experienced opera. Italy, with its ancient theaters and passionate public, seemed to embrace what America had overlooked. It is important to linger on these first flames, for they tell us something essential about Callas. Her rise was not smooth or inevitable. She was not a child prodigy effortlessly adored. She was resisted, doubted, even dismissed. But like iron tempered in fire, her artistry was forged through rejection as much as through praise. Each ovation was sweeter for having been earned against indifference. Each role she inhabited carried not only the character's fate, but also her own struggle for recognition. One can imagine her after a performance in those years, standing alone in a quiet dressing room, the applause still echoing faintly in the hall, the scent of roses on the floor, the sweat drying on her skin. Did she feel triumphant? Or did she feel the weight of expectations pressing even harder upon her shoulders? Perhaps both, for Maria's life was never one of simple emotions, but of contradictions, each feeling entangled with its opposite. And so the first flames of her career flickered into being, fragile yet undeniable. From Athens to Verona, from hunger to ovation, the young soprano's path was already marked by extremes. The world had only begun to notice, but those who heard her knew that something rare had arrived, something that could not easily be compared or confined. Let us leave her there for now, standing at the edge of greater stages, her arms full of roses, her heart still uncertain, her voice echoing beyond the modest theaters that first welcomed it. The curtain falls, and with it the faint fragrance of flowers lingers in the air, mingling with the rustle of programs folded into pockets. The scent does not fade, but seems to follow her, carried onward to new shores where destiny waits impatiently. The fragrance of roses that clung to her dressing room after those early triumphs did not vanish but seemed to drift outward, as if carried by unseen winds toward distant shores. That scent of recognition, delicate yet intoxicating, lingered in Maria's memory as she prepared to leave behind the modest stages of Athens and the uncertainty of New York, setting her course instead toward Italy, the land where opera itself had been born. It was not merely a change of geography, but a passage toward destiny. For in Italy she would meet not only her greatest opportunities, but also the forces that would shape her forever. The journey to Italy was not one of luxury. Maria was still young, still unproven, her finances strained, her ambitions heavy. Yet she carried with her something rarer than wealth, a voice that could not be ignored once it was heard, a voice that carried within it the hunger of her childhood and the resilience of a war-scarred youth. When she disembarked in Verona to sing La Gioconda, she was not yet La Divina, but those who listened felt at once the jolt of something extraordinary. In Verona, she met Giovanni Battista Meneghini, a wealthy industrialist much older than herself. He was not a figure of glamour or brilliance, but he saw in Maria a star waiting to be nurtured, and he offered her stability, protection, and the financial support that her career required. In time, he would become her husband, though even in those early encounters, the imbalance of their bond was clear. She, young and burning with ambition, he established and eager to devote himself to her success. Their union would serve her professionally, though the flame of true passion was never present. Italy, however, gave her something far more valuable than personal alliances. It gave her a stage upon which she could prove herself in the very heart of operatic tradition. To sing in Italy was to face audiences who knew opera not as distant entertainment, but as a living inheritance. Here, applause was given sparingly, criticism swiftly voiced, and only the most compelling performances endured. For Maria, this was both a challenge and a calling. She thrived on the intensity, on the knowledge that every note mattered, that sincerity could not be faked before listeners whose very blood seemed steeped in music. In Florence, she sang roles that tested her agility, forcing her to refine the bel canto techniques instilled by Elvira de Hidalgo. These performances revealed to her and to the world that her voice was not only powerful but flexible, capable of weaving delicate threads as well as unleashing torrents of sound. Critics began to speak of her as a phenomenon, though some still found her timbre harsh, her presence too forceful. Yet even the skeptics admitted that she could not be ignored. Unlike many singers who floated across the stage like ornaments, Maria stormed it like a conqueror. Her arrival in Milan and her first appearances at La Scala marked the true turning point. La Scala was not merely a theater, it was a shrine, a place where careers were exalted or destroyed, where tradition weighed heavily and innovation was greeted with suspicion. To step onto that stage was to place oneself in dialogue with the ghosts of Verdi, Bellini, and Puccini. For Maria, it was both terrifying and irresistible. She entered not as a supplicant, but as if she belonged, her voice filling the ornate hall with its strange blend of steel and sorrow. The audience, at first uncertain, soon found themselves captivated. It was in Italy that her reputation as an interpreter, rather than merely a singer, began to take root. She was not content to produce beautiful sound. She sought to embody character, to live the drama as though it were her own. Directors and conductors recognized in her a rare gift, and some, like Luchino Visconti, who would later direct her in legendary productions, saw in her the possibility of reshaping opera itself into a living theater of truth. Maria embraced this vision with ferocity. She rehearsed endlessly, demanding precision from herself and from others, unwilling to settle for anything less than complete immersion. To some, this made her difficult, even tyrannical, but to those who understood, it was the mark of genius. And yet, even as her star began to rise, shadows followed her. She was painfully aware of her appearance, of her weight, of the whispers that she did not look like the heroines she portrayed. In those early years in Italy, she had not yet undergone the dramatic transformation of her body that would later stun the world. On stage, her immense presence often transcended physical form, but off-stage she carried herself with the self-consciousness of one who feared ridicule. Praise for her voice did not silence the inner echo of her mother's cruel comparisons. She sought solace in work, in discipline, in the belief that art could shield her from the sting of judgment. There was also the lingering ache of displacement. Though she was Greek by birth and American by upbringing, she found in Italy the first true sense of belonging. Here, audiences understood her intensity, critics debated her with passion, and colleagues, though often wary, recognized her as one of their own. She was no longer an outsider knocking at the door. She was an artist standing within the circle of tradition, ready to reshape it with her own force. Yet belonging always carried a cost, and Maria knew that in Italy, the expectations would be relentless. Her voyage toward destiny, then, was not only a journey across seas, but a journey into the heart of herself. Each performance stripped away the protective shell she had carried through childhood, exposing her more fully to both adoration and attack. Each ovation was thrilling, yet each criticism pierced deeply, confirming the insecurities she could never fully silence. She was ascending, but she was also being consumed by the very flame that lifted her. Let us pause at this moment of arrival. Maria Callas in Italy, still young but already formidable, her voice shaking the walls of La Scala, her name whispered in admiration and in doubt. She is not yet La Divina, not yet the legend she will become, but the seeds are planted, the soil rich, the air charged with expectation. The spotlight dims, the curtain lowers, and the vast hall of La Scala empties, leaving only a single lamp glowing over the stage, casting long shadows on the worn boards where she has just sung. The applause has faded, but the silence that remains feels alive, as though the theater itself has taken note of her and is waiting for her return. It is in this silence, beneath that solitary light, that we leave her now, poised on the threshold of transformation. Beneath the solitary lamp that glowed over the empty boards of La Scala, shadows stretched long and silent, as though the theater itself were holding its breath. It was here, in this temple of opera, that Maria Callas would forge the identity that the world would forever remember. No longer merely a promising young soprano from Athens or Verona, she would become La Divina, the Divine One, a title bestowed by audiences who felt in her performances something beyond artistry, something that seemed to touch the realm of the sacred. La Scala was not easily conquered. Its audiences were notoriously demanding, unafraid to boo even the most celebrated of stars, unafraid to voice displeasure at the smallest flaw. To sing here was to expose oneself to judgment harsher than any critic's pen, for the people of Milan regarded opera not as spectacle, but as inheritance, a matter of civic pride, almost of identity. Callas, with her restless ambition and fierce intensity, seemed both perfectly suited and dangerously vulnerable to such a stage. Her first performances at La Scala revealed the qualities that would define her legend. She did not sing as others sang. Where many sopranos sought beauty, smoothness, and ornament, Callas sought truth, drama, and flame. She hurled her voice into the music with a force that could startle, bending notes to convey anguish, softening into whispers that seemed too fragile to carry, then soaring again with a ferocity that left the audience trembling. It was not flawless in the conventional sense. There were rough edges, sudden shifts, sounds that seemed to crack under the weight of emotion. Yet it was precisely in those imperfections that listeners found authenticity. She did not polish life's jagged corners. She revealed them. Conductors and directors recognized that in Callas they had more than a singer. They had a tragedian in the lineage of ancient Greek theater, one who did not merely interpret but embodied the roles she sang. Collaborations with visionary directors such as Luchino Visconti elevated her further. Under his guidance, Callas discovered how gesture, movement, and silence could deepen her dramatic impact. She rehearsed endlessly, obsessively, often driving colleagues to exasperation, but she demanded no less from herself than absolute surrender to the work. Those who stood beside her on stage sometimes felt eclipsed, yet even they admitted that she raised the entire art to a higher level. It was here that her portrayals of Norma, Lucia, Medea, and Tosca became definitive. Each was transformed under her interpretation, stripped of operatic convention and made into living, breathing women. In Norma, she was not merely a priestess, but a woman torn between love and duty, her voice carrying the weight of betrayal. In Lucia, she was fragile to the point of breaking, her madness not a showpiece, but a collapse of the soul. And in Medea, perhaps her most haunting role, she seemed to channel an elemental rage, as if summoning forces older than music itself. Audiences left the theater shaken, unable to forget what they had witnessed. It was also in Milan that the legend of Callas, as a figure larger than life, began to grow. She was no longer only a singer, but a symbol of intensity, of uncompromising truth, of art that demanded everything. Admirers adored her with fervor, yet detractors sharpened their knives, calling her temperamental, difficult, even cruel. Stories circulated of her clashes with colleagues, her fiery temperament, her perfectionism that brooked no compromise. Some were true, others exaggerated, but together they fed the image of a diva unlike any other, both adored and feared. The press, ever hungry for drama, contrasted her with Renata Tebaldi, another great soprano of the time whose voice was pure, smooth, and serenely beautiful. Where Tebaldi embodied warmth, Callas embodied fire. Audiences were asked to choose between them, as if art could be measured like a contest. Callas herself dismissed such rivalries, yet the world seemed eager to pit them against each other, and the tension only heightened her myth. She was not merely a singer, but a character in the grand opera of public imagination. Yet behind the triumphs, there remained the vulnerable woman who had once sung in a darkened Athens hall during the war. Success did not erase insecurity. If anything, it sharpened it. She heard the boos as keenly as the bravos. She read the cruel reviews, the gossip about her weight, her looks, her temperament, and she absorbed them as wounds. Even as La Scala crowned her as its queen, she remained haunted by the voice of her mother, by the childhood echoes of inadequacy. Perhaps it was this very fragility that made her performances so compelling. For when she sang, she was not merely acting. She was offering the raw truth of her own wounds, transmuted into music. One can imagine the atmosphere after a Callas performance at La Scala in those years. The theater emptied slowly, the red velvet seats still warm, the chandeliers dimming, the scent of perfume and flowers mingling in the air. On the stage, scattered petals from bouquets lay forgotten, their colors fading in the half-light. In the dressing room, Callas might sit alone before a mirror, the applause still echoing faintly, the rouge on her cheeks beginning to smudge, the costume heavy on her shoulders. Did she feel the weight of divinity then, or only exhaustion, solitude, and the knowledge that tomorrow she must do it all again? Thus was born La Divina, not by proclamation but by a gradual recognition that what Callas offered was not merely performance, but revelation. She stood apart, untouchable yet exposed, adored yet isolated. The crown of greatness was hers, but it pressed heavily upon her brow. As the years unfolded, her bond with La Scala deepened, yet with it came the inevitability of conflict. For a temple that raises its gods also tests them, and Callas, with her unyielding standards and volatile spirit, would find herself both enthroned and embattled within its walls. The glow of triumph was never without shadows, and so we leave her here in the Grand Theatre of Milan, her figure outlined in a solitary spotlight, the stage board still vibrating faintly from the force of her voice. The curtain has fallen, the applause has ceased, yet the silence feels charged, as though the ghosts of Verdi and Bellini are whispering in the rafters. The light dims slowly, leaving the stage empty, and from that emptiness arises the faint sound of another voice, distant, echoing, a rival's aria carried on the air. The faint echo of another voice lingered in the silence after Callas's triumphs at La Scala. It was not her own, but that of Renata Tebaldi, the soprano whose name would be forever linked with hers, as though the two were destined to exist in contrast, light against flame, serenity against storm. In truth, there was no reason their paths should have been set in opposition, for each possessed a gift of her own, different yet profound, and yet the world, ever hungry for drama beyond the stage, insisted on shaping them into rivals, pitting one voice against the other, one woman against the other, until their names became entwined in shadow as much as in song. Tebaldi's voice was everything that Callas's was not: pure, smooth, effortlessly lyrical, a stream of sound that seemed untouched by human struggle. Where Callas gave jagged edges and sudden bursts of fire, Tebaldi offered serenity, the kind of beauty that caressed rather than cut. Audiences who longed for comfort, for the balm of loveliness, found in Tebaldi their solace. She was called La Voce d'Angelo, the voice of an angel, while Callas was called La Divina, the divine one, but with an undertone of awe tinged with fear. In this contrast, the press found fertile ground. It was in the 1950s, at the height of both women's powers, that the so-called rivalry began to dominate conversations. Journalists delighted in the comparisons. Tebaldi's warmth against Callas's fire, Tebaldi's graciousness against Callas's tempestuousness, Tebaldi's physical beauty against Callas's awkward transformation. Every ovation for one was cast as a slight against the other. Fans divided themselves into camps, some swearing by Tebaldi's angelic purity, others defending Callas's searing truth. Opera houses felt the tension, as though the very art form had been split into factions. But what of the women themselves? Here lies the mystery. At times, they spoke kindly of each other, offering respect as one artist to another. At other times, sharp words passed between them, sometimes born of pride, sometimes stoked by the manipulations of those who profited from the rivalry. Did Maria truly despise Renata, or did she resent the way Tebaldi's existence reflected back her own insecurities? Did Tebaldi truly envy Callas, or did she simply wish to be free of the constant comparisons? Perhaps neither woman truly knew, for rivalry, once conjured, has a life of its own, feeding on whispers, glances, and silences as much as on words. For Callas, the rivalry was especially painful because it touched upon her deepest wound, the sense of never being beautiful enough, never being loved without condition. The praise of Tebaldi's voice as angelic seemed to suggest that Maria's own was something harsher, even monstrous. When audiences described Tebaldi as warm and gracious, it seemed to imply that Callas was cold and cruel. Thus, every compliment given to her rival felt to Maria like an insult directed at herself. She who gave her very soul upon the stage could not bear to think of being measured and found wanting. And yet, how ironic that it was precisely the qualities that critics called harsh, her steel, her fire, her imperfections, that made her unforgettable. Tebaldi might have comforted, but Callas seared. Tebaldi offered beauty, but Callas offered truth. And perhaps that was why their names became inseparable, for each revealed what the other lacked. Audiences could not resist the temptation to compare, to choose, to argue, as though through their rivalry something essential about art and life itself was being contested. Whether we seek consolation or confrontation, whether we prefer sweetness or bitterness, whether we crave peace or truth. In Milan, the rivalry became a kind of theater beyond the theater. La Scala, which had crowned Callas its queen, also welcomed Tebaldi, and audiences waited breathlessly to see which soprano would triumph. Sometimes the tension was palpable even in the air before a performance, as though the audience itself had become divided into camps of loyalty. Bravos for one could turn into jeers for the other, and the applause that followed a performance often carried the sharp edge of competition. Callas, who felt every sound in the hall as a personal judgment, absorbed these divisions deeply. They confirmed her suspicion that love was conditional, that admiration was fickle, that she was forever on trial. Yet rivalry also fueled her. She drove herself harder, demanded more from her voice and her body, pursued the highest peaks of interpretation, as though to prove once and for all that she was not merely a singer, but an artist without equal. It was during these years of tension that she gave some of her most legendary performances, pouring into them all the defiance, insecurity, and fire that rivalry had ignited. One might almost say that without Tebaldi, without the shadow cast by comparison, Callas' flame might not have burned so fiercely. And what of Tebaldi? For her part, she continued to sing with her own grace, often bewildered by the ferocity of the comparisons. She once said that there was room for both voices, that she did not wish for rivalry. Perhaps she was sincere, perhaps weary of the endless arguments. Yet even she must have felt the shadow, for no artist can remain untouched by the way the world insists upon measuring her against another. Thus both women were bound together, not by their own choosing, but by the gaze of the public, the appetite of the press, and the very nature of fame, which demands stories of conflict as much as stories of triumph. One imagines the two sopranos, not on stage but alone, each in her own dressing room after a performance at La Scala. Callas, staring into the mirror, still flushed with exertion, perhaps hearing in her mind the bravos mixed with jeers. Tebaldi in another room, her face serene yet perhaps shadowed by the knowledge that no ovation was hers alone, that it was always weighed against another's. Did they sense each other across the distance, not as enemies but as mirrors, each reflecting the other's greatness and insecurity? Perhaps they did, though such things remain unspoken, left to history's speculation. The rivalry would never truly end, even when both women had passed their prime. It lived on in recordings, in memories, in the endless debates of admirers who still ask, Tebaldi or Callas, angel or flame, beauty or truth? Yet perhaps the answer is not to choose, but to recognize that in their contrast lies the richness of art itself. Without Tebaldi's serenity, Callas' fire might have seemed too fierce. Without Callas' truth, Tebaldi's beauty might have seemed too mild. Together, they embodied the eternal tension between consolation and confrontation, between dream and reality. And so we leave Callas here, in the shadows of rivalry, her crown both glittering and heavy, her name both adored and contested. The faint sound of another soprano's aria still lingers, not as a challenge, but as an echo, a reminder that greatness is never solitary, that even the divine are bound by the presence of others. The stage is dim, the applause has faded, and in the silence we hear the creak of a corset being tightened, the beginning of another transformation that will change her image forever. The creak of the corset tightening in the dimness was more than the sound of fabric straining against bone and flesh. It was the sound of Maria Callas reshaping herself, of a woman bending her own form to match the image that the world demanded. In the early years of her triumphs, she had been a figure of power rather than grace, heavy-set, statuesque, a presence that filled the stage with authority even before she sang. Yet in the middle of the 1950s, something changed. Slowly, then suddenly, her body transformed. The woman whom audiences once described as matronly emerged as slender, striking, almost unrecognizable. The metamorphosis was so complete that some called it a rebirth, others a sacrifice, and many wondered what it had cost. The truth of this transformation is clouded by speculation. Some said she achieved it through an iron will, shedding nearly 80 pounds through diet, discipline, and relentless determination. Others whispered of illness, of a mysterious parasite contracted from undercooked meat, a sickness that stripped her body as surely as any regimen. Maria herself offered different explanations at different times, perhaps unwilling to pin her transformation to any single cause, or perhaps protecting the privacy of her pain. Whatever the means, the result was undeniable. The Callas, who stepped onto stages after the mid-1950s, was no longer the awkward girl mocked for her size, but a figure of striking elegance. Her features sharpened, her gowns draped with dramatic effect, her very silhouette reshaped into legend. For some, this metamorphosis was a miracle, aligning her outer appearance with the inner fire of her art. The characters she portrayed, Norma, Violetta, Tosca, seemed more believable when embodied by a woman of statuesque beauty rather than one burdened by excess weight. Her movements became freer, her gestures more fluid, her presence more commanding. Directors rejoiced, for now their productions could marry voice and image in a unity that had long eluded them. Yet for others, the transformation carried a sense of unease. Had Maria sacrificed too much of herself in pursuit of acceptance? Was the price of beauty the very strength that had once made her voice so commanding? Some listeners claimed that her sound grew lighter after her weight loss, that the immense volume and darkness of her earlier years gave way to a more delicate timbre. Whether this was truth or projection, the debate endures, another layer in the mystery of Callas. And what of Maria herself? In interviews, she spoke of her new body with pride, as though it had freed her from ridicule, allowing her to walk into rooms without shame, to wear gowns without fear of laughter. Yet beneath the pride, there was vulnerability. For a woman whose art had always drawn from wounds, the transformation did not erase insecurity, but perhaps deepened it. For now, she was praised not only for her voice, but for her beauty. And beauty is an even more fragile crown than genius. Did she ever wonder if admiration for her image had supplanted admiration for her art? Did she fear that love, once conditional, would now become even more so? The world, of course, delighted in her metamorphosis. Newspapers printed before and after photographs, marveling at the new Callas, the diva reborn as an icon of style. Fashion houses clamored to dress her. Photographers sought to capture her angular elegance. Audiences gazed not only at her performances, but at her figure, her gowns, her poise. She became not merely a singer, but a symbol of transformation, a woman who had reshaped her destiny through sheer will. Admirers saw in her story the promise that one could escape ridicule, transcend circumstance, emerge radiant from shadows. But symbols are heavier than crowns. To be made into an icon of transformation is also to be trapped by it, for symbols are not allowed to falter. From this time onward, Callas was expected not only to sing divinely, but to look divine, to maintain the slender silhouette, the polished image. The corset became not only a garment, but a metaphor for the constraints she accepted, the discipline that bound her. She had won beauty, but at what cost to her freedom? One must imagine her in those years, alone in her room, tightening the laces of her corset before stepping into the spotlight, the sound of the fabric straining against her ribs. Did she feel empowered, or did she feel trapped? Did she see in the mirror the triumph of transformation, or did she see a stranger staring back, a woman sculpted by necessity rather than by choice? Such questions linger, unanswered, woven into the myth of Callas. And yet, it cannot be denied that this transformation altered her art as much as her image. Freed from the heaviness that had once constrained her movement, she brought new life to her characters. Her Violetta in La Traviata was no longer simply sung. It was lived, embodied in gestures of fragility and desperation that audiences found heartbreaking. Her Tosca was not only a voice, but a figure of grace, her movements echoing the intensity of her music. Even her Medea, a role of ferocity and rage, seemed more terrifying when embodied by a slender figure whose fragility made her fury all the more unsettling. Thus, the transformation of the body became inseparable from the transformation of the art. Whether it weakened her voice or not, it deepened her dramatic truth, and for Callas, truth was always the highest goal. She did not wish merely to sing beautifully. She wished to reveal, to expose, to lay bare. Her body, reshaped, became another instrument, another layer of her revelation. Yet the corset still creaked, the laces still bound, the mirror still whispered of insecurity. The price of beauty is never simple. Maria Callas had achieved a metamorphosis that astonished the world, but she remained restless, haunted, searching for something beyond applause and admiration. The transformation of her body had brought her triumph, but it had not brought her peace. And so we leave her here, in the glow of cameras, the applause of audiences, the adoration of designers and directors, her figure slim, her gowns shimmering, her image immortalized in photographs that still circulate today. The room smells faintly of powder and perfume. The corset creaks softly as it is unlaced at the end of the night, and the rustle of legal papers lies waiting on a table, papers that tie her life to Giovanni Battista Meneghini, the husband who has devoted himself to her, but whose love will never still the restlessness of her soul. The rustle of legal papers on the table carried no music, only the dry sound of obligation. Yet it was with such papers that Maria Callas bound herself to Giovanni Battista Meneghini, the man who had stood faithfully beside her as her career began to rise in Italy. He was older by more than 2 decades, an industrialist of means, a man respected in Verona but far from the glamour of the operatic world. To Maria, still young, still uncertain of her place in the wider cosmos, he represented something she had never truly known before: security. The applause of audiences could vanish, critics could turn, even her own body could betray her. But Meneghini offered stability, devotion, and the promise that she would not face the world entirely alone. Their marriage in 1949 was a quiet affair, lacking the passion and extravagance one might expect of a woman destined for legend. To some, it seemed a pragmatic choice, almost calculated. She gave him her youth and her brilliance. He gave her his wealth and his guardianship. He became her manager, arranging contracts, protecting her from financial uncertainty, guiding her through the complexities of operatic politics. In return, she offered him the reflected glow of her growing fame. They were bound not by fire but by an arrangement that seemed, at least for a time, mutually sustaining. And yet, for Maria, the arrangement was never truly satisfying. She was a woman of intensity, of burning desires, of insatiable hunger for recognition and love. Meneghini's affection, steady and paternal, could not quench that hunger. His devotion, though genuine, was never enough to reach the deep wounds carved into her soul since childhood. He gave her comfort, but she longed for passion. He gave her loyalty, but she yearned for adoration that was absolute and consuming. To a woman whose art drew upon extremes, the quiet loyalty of her husband felt at times like a prison rather than a refuge. Still, she played her part. In public, she appeared as the dutiful wife, grateful for his support, respectful of his presence. In private, she felt the confinement of being tied to a man whose world was narrower than hers, whose ambitions were fulfilled in seeing hers rise. She loved him perhaps with a kind of gratitude, but gratitude is a poor substitute for desire. He, for his part, adored her with the steadfastness of a man who believed he had won more than he deserved. He signed the contracts, managed the estates, ensured that her earnings were protected. He placed her on a pedestal and perhaps thought that was enough. But to be placed on a pedestal is to be isolated. Maria felt increasingly alone, even within marriage. Meneghini's devotion lacked the storm of emotion that she both feared and craved. She would later say that she married him not out of love, but out of weakness, out of a need for stability at a time when she was vulnerable. Perhaps she spoke harshly in hindsight, yet the truth seems to lie somewhere in between. Their union was real, but it was cold. The contrast between her private life and her public image deepened the sense of contradiction that marked her existence. On stage, she embodied heroines who loved with reckless abandon, who defied gods and kings for passion. Off stage, she returned to a husband whose affection was steady but uninspired. In her art, she lived the fires of Tosca's jealousy, Norma's betrayal, Medea's vengeance. In her life, she endured the quiet routines of marriage to a man who could never match the intensity of her characters. It was as though she needed the stage to experience the passions denied her in reality. The tension between them grew over time, though Meneghini remained loyal even as she withdrew emotionally. He invested himself in her career, sometimes to his own detriment. for she often bristled at his managerial decisions, accusing him of holding her back or failing to understand her artistic needs. Yet he never abandoned her, never betrayed her trust. In the end, it was Maria who drifted away, not through malice, but through a hunger for something she could not find in his arms. And yet, one must not dismiss Meneghini entirely as an insignificant chapter. Without him, Maria might never have reached the heights she did. He gave her the grounding that allowed her to focus on her art, shielded her from financial ruin, offered her a stability that, though unsatisfying, was necessary in the tumult of her rise. He was not the love of her life, but perhaps he was the guardian she needed at that moment. The story of their marriage is not one of betrayal or scandal, not yet. It is a story of quiet coldness, of two people bound together by mutual need rather than by fire. And perhaps that is why it feels so haunting. For Maria Callas was a woman who lived in extremes, and the absence of fire was, to her, a kind of death. Imagine her in those years, returning home after a performance at La Scala, the applause still echoing in her ears, the flowers still in her hands, only to sit at a table with her husband in quiet domesticity. The contrast must have been unbearable. The stage offered her ecstasy, tragedy, immortality. Home offered her routine, safety, silence. She was a woman divided, her soul burning with passions that her life could not contain. The rustle of those legal papers which once bound her to Meneghini never truly ceased. They lay always in the background like clipped wings rustling whenever she tried to fly too high. Their marriage lasted nearly a decade, but even before it ended, its limitations were clear. She was grateful, yes, but gratitude is not love. She was protected, yes, but protection is not freedom. She was admired, yes, but admiration is not passion. The story of Maria Callas would soon move beyond Meneghini into storms of love and betrayal far more consuming. But the shadow of her cold marriage lingered even then, a reminder that security alone could never satisfy her restless soul. Perhaps it was inevitable that she would seek elsewhere the fire she could not find at home. And so we leave her here, sitting at a quiet table, her gowns hung carefully in another room, her husband speaking softly of contracts and estates, the clink of cutlery faint against the silence. Outside, the world clamored for drama, and soon it would find it. The scratching of pens could already be heard, the journalists eager to weave stories of scandal and temper. The rustle of legal papers fades now into the sharper sound of ink upon paper, preparing the stage for the storm of public controversy that was about to engulf her. The scratching of pens grew sharper, filling the silence of her private life with the restless hunger of the press. Maria Callas, who had long lived under the gaze of audiences, now found herself living under the gaze of newspapers, magazines, and gossip columns that hungered not only for her voice, but for her failings. A diva of such brilliance could not remain untouched by controversy, for the world that exalted her also longed to see her falter. And falter she did, not in the purity of her art, but in the vulnerability of her human body and spirit. The most infamous of these moments came on a January night in 1958 in Rome, when Callas was to sing Norma before an audience that included the President of Italy and a gathering of dignitaries. The theater was full, anticipation heavy in the air, the chandeliers blazing, the programs rustling in eager hands. Maria appeared on stage, resplendent, her voice carrying through the opening with its familiar authority. Yet even as she sang, a sickness gnawed at her. Bronchitis and exhaustion had weakened her, and her voice began to betray her. Notes that once soared faltered, phrases broke, the flame flickered. After the first act, she withdrew, unable to continue. To fall ill is human, yet the press made of it a scandal. Headlines screamed that she had abandoned her audience, that she had walked out on a president, that she had betrayed the sanctity of performance. Rumors spread that it was not illness but arrogance, not frailty but temper. The word temperamental clung to her thereafter like a curse, as though every demand for artistic integrity, every refusal to compromise, every illness was a sign of diva behavior rather than human need. Callas herself was wounded deeply by this storm. She who had given so much, who had sacrificed body and soul for truth in art, found herself condemned not for dishonesty, but for failure to endure beyond endurance. She was not permitted weakness. To be divine is to be flawless, and the world that crowned her La Divina now demanded that she live without flaw. In her private writings and conversations, she expressed bewilderment and sorrow that audiences and critics could turn so quickly that they could forget the years of devotion for the sake of a single night. Yet this was the paradox of her fame. The higher she soared, the more eagerly the world waited for her to fall. The Rome incident was not the only scandal. Stories multiplied of feuds with conductors, of quarrels with directors, of performances canceled at the last moment. Some were exaggerated, others rooted in truth, but all were magnified. The press delighted in portraying her as a tempest, a woman ruled by pride and fury. To the public, the narrative of the temperamental diva was irresistible. It made of her life an opera as dramatic as any she sang on stage. And so, even as her art reached heights of transcendence, her reputation grew darker, shadowed by tales of scandal and arrogance. Yet one must pause here to consider what lay beneath the stories. Was Callas truly so difficult, or was she simply uncompromising in her pursuit of excellence? Was her so-called temper the refusal to accept mediocrity, the insistence that opera be treated not as entertainment, but as sacred drama? Those who worked closely with her often admitted that her demands were great, but so were her sacrifices. She did not ask of others more than she asked of herself, and she gave herself entirely, body and soul, to every role. Perhaps her real crime was that she refused to be ordinary, and ordinariness is what the world demands when it tires of genius. The scars of scandal left their mark. Maria grew more guarded, more isolated, her trust in audiences and colleagues shaken. She continued to perform with fire, but beneath the fire was a tremor of vulnerability, a fear that the applause could turn to jeers, the bravos to boos. It is in recordings from these years that one can hear the fragility beneath the power, the sense that every note carries not only the character's fate, but her own. The art was deeper, the truth sharper, but the cost was immense. And yet scandal did not diminish her fame. On the contrary, it made her legend more compelling. For the public, she was no longer only a voice, but a story, a character in the opera of life. Admirers defended her with passion, critics attacked her with equal fervor, and her name filled newspapers as often as it filled theaters. She had become more than a singer. She had become myth, and myths, by their nature, are always contested, always torn between adoration and destruction. Imagine her in those years, returning from the Rome scandal, the hotel room dim, the curtains drawn, her body weary from illness, her heart heavy from humiliation. Outside, reporters clamored for statements, their pens poised, their cameras ready. Inside, she sat in silence, the sound of her own breathing rough in her throat, the applause of the past drowned out by the scratching of pens that sought to write her downfall. Did she weep? Did she rage? Or did she simply sit in silence, gathering the fragments of strength that she would need to step once more onto the stage? For she did return, again and again. Each scandal was followed by a triumph, each fall by a rise. The public that condemned her also could not resist her, for no one else offered what she gave, the raw truth of life itself, transmuted into sound. Even scandal became part of her performance, another layer of drama that blurred the line between stage and life. But scandal is also a prelude, a foreshadowing of storms to come. For beyond the headlines and the jeers lay another force waiting to engulf her, a force far more personal, far more consuming: love. If her marriage to Meneghini was the rustle of legal papers, then her next chapter would be the shattering of champagne glasses, the glitter and the ruin of passion with Aristotle Onassis. The press, already sharpened against her, would find new fodder in that union of diva and magnate, and Maria, who had endured scandal with sorrow, would discover in love both ecstasy and despair. And so we leave her here, in the aftermath of Rome, the scratching of pens still loud, the headlines still cruel. The theater is empty, the lights extinguished, yet outside, on the deck of a yacht, a champagne glass trembles in the hand of a man whose gaze has already fixed upon her. It slips, shatters against the deck, the fragments glinting like stars against the wood. The champagne glass lay shattered on the deck of the yacht, its fragments catching the light of the Mediterranean sun, each shard glinting like a fragment of destiny. It was among such luxuries upon the polished decks of ships that cut through the blue waters of Greece that Maria Callas met Aristotle Onassis. If her marriage to Meneghini had been written in the rustle of legal papers, her encounter with Onassis was carved in the sound of waves and laughter, in the heady fragrance of salt and wine, in the dangerous intoxication of power disguised as charm. Onassis was no stranger to legend himself, a magnate of shipping, a man who had risen from nothing to accumulate wealth so vast it seemed almost mythic. He embodied the ruthless ambition and glittering allure of post-war success. Where Meneghini was solid, dependable, almost provincial, Onassis was cosmopolitan, magnetic, a figure whose presence dominated every room he entered. He had the air of one accustomed to conquest, whether of markets, of nations' respect, or of hearts. For Maria, still aching with loneliness despite her triumphs, his attention was like a sudden flame flaring in the dark. Their first encounters were charged with an energy that neither could ignore. She, the divine diva, whose voice had conquered La Scala and beyond, and he, the worldly titan whose ships commanded oceans. It seemed almost inevitable that their paths would collide, two forces of will drawn together not by chance, but by the gravity of their own magnitudes. Yet destiny, as always in Callas' life, came with complexity, for she was still married to Meneghini, and Onassis was entangled in his own affairs. Their union from the beginning bore the mark of transgression, of risk, of scandal. Maria was not naive. She knew that Onassis was a man of appetites, that his charm concealed a ruthless pragmatism, and yet she was drawn to him as she had never been drawn to anyone else. His presence made her feel desired not merely as an artist, not merely as a voice, but as a woman. The applause of audiences could not quiet her longing for intimacy, for passion, for someone who saw her not as a diva, but as Maria. Onassis, with his intensity, seemed to answer that longing. Their affair unfolded in secrecy at first, whispered in salons, hinted at in the press, but soon it blazed openly, defying convention and propriety. Maria left Meneghini, abandoning the stability that had once anchored her. For this, some condemned her, others admired her. But to Callas, the choice seemed unavoidable. She had lived too long in the cold safety of gratitude. Now she demanded fire, even if it consumed her. Onassis was that fire. They traveled together on his yachts, their laughter carried on the wind, their quarrels just as fierce as their embraces. She found herself both exalted and diminished in his company, exalted by his attention, diminished by his dominance. For Onassis was a man who prized conquest above constancy. To love him was to surrender to a game in which the rules could change at any moment. And yet, Maria surrendered. Perhaps she believed that her devotion could transform him, that her love could soften the heart of the magnate as her voice had softened the hearts of audiences. Or perhaps she simply needed him, as one addict needs the substance that both elevates and destroys. Her art, during these years, began to shift. She sang less frequently, withdrew from some roles, canceled engagements. Critics whispered that her passion for Onassis was weakening her discipline, that she was sacrificing her career for a man. In truth, the matter was more complex. Years of relentless performance had already taken their toll on her body and her voice. The exhaustion of constant travel, the weight of scandal, the insecurities gnawing at her, all had eroded her stamina. But it is also true that her heart, once consumed entirely by music, was now divided. Love or obsession demanded from her the same total surrender that art had once claimed. She could not give herself wholly to both. And yet, even in this retreat, her legend grew. For the story of Callas and Onassis captivated the world. The diva and the magnate, the goddess of opera and the titan of shipping, entwined in a romance that seemed itself an opera, complete with passion, betrayal, and spectacle. Photographs of them together, her eyes luminous, his arm possessive, were printed across Europe and America. Audiences followed not only her performances but her love life, as if the stage had spilled irretrievably into reality. But beneath the glitter was unease. Maria gave herself entirely to Onassis, but Onassis never gave himself entirely to her. He admired her, desired her, perhaps even loved her in moments, but he remained elusive, restless, unwilling to bind himself. For a woman who demanded total devotion, who longed for the unconditional love she had never known, this half-love was both intoxicating and cruel. She lived in the constant tension between ecstasy and despair, exalted one moment, abandoned the next. Her friends warned her, her colleagues pitied her, but Maria remained steadfast. To her, Onassis was not merely a man. He was the embodiment of the passion she had sought all her life, the answer to the emptiness that applause could not fill. One imagines them together on the deck of his yacht, the sea stretching endlessly around them, the night air warm, the stars scattered like fragments of broken glass. She, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose in the wind, her eyes searching his for promises he would never fully make. He leaning back, a glass in hand, his gaze already turning elsewhere, restless, hungry for the next conquest. Between them, a silence as vast as the sea, broken only by the lapping of waves. This was the arrival of Onassis into her life. Not a gentle blessing, but a storm. Not a refuge, but a tempest. It marked the beginning of a chapter that would consume her, that would redefine her legacy as much as her voice had. For in him, she found not only love, but the mirror of her own contradictions, brilliance mixed with cruelty, power entwined with fragility, triumph shadowed by loss. And so we leave her here, her hand resting on the polished wood of a yacht's railing, her heart racing with desire and fear. Behind her lies the world of Meneghini's papers and contracts, of security without fire. Before her lies the world of Onassis, dazzling and destructive, a sea without anchor. The waves continue to roll, never still, as if echoing the turbulence within her. The tide rolled endlessly beneath the yacht, its rhythm steady and eternal, unlike the turbulence within Maria Callas's heart. For in her affair with Aristotle Onassis, nothing was steady, nothing eternal, except the ache of longing and the certainty of unrest. What began as an intoxicating fire soon became a tempest in which passion and betrayal were woven so tightly together that she could scarcely distinguish between them. At first, their love seemed to her like a liberation. She had stepped out of the shadow of her cold marriage to Meneghini and into the blinding light of a passion that consumed her. Onassis gave her a taste of something she had never known, the thrill of being desired for herself, not for her voice, not for her fame, not for her ability to draw crowds. He admired her beauty, her wit, her fire. He delighted in her presence, paraded her before his friends, held her close on his yacht as if she were a jewel he had claimed. To Maria, who had so often felt unseen beneath the glare of public attention, this intimacy was overwhelming. She surrendered herself to it with the same totality that she had once given to music. But Onassis was a man of appetites, and his devotion was never steady. He craved novelty, excitement, conquest. His love for Maria was real, but it was restless. He could be tender one moment, harsh the next, faithful in words and faithless in deeds. He would vanish for days, then return with extravagant gifts. He would profess adoration, then humiliate her with flirtations in public. For Maria, who yearned for constancy, this volatility was agony, and yet she endured it, clung to it, even cherished it, for she could not bear the thought of life without the storm he brought. Her career, meanwhile, began to bear the marks of her divided heart. Where once she had been relentless in her discipline, rehearsing endlessly, demanding perfection from herself and others, she now grew distracted. She canceled performances, withdrew from roles, allowed her professional commitments to yield to her personal obsession. Critics whispered that she was squandering her gift, that she was losing the discipline that had made her great. Some said she was sacrificing her art for a man, a narrative that cut deeply into her pride. Yet there was truth in it, for her energies, once entirely devoted to music, were now consumed by the fire of her love and the anguish of his betrayals. Still, when she did perform, the depth of her emotion seemed even greater. Audiences who heard her in these years spoke of an intensity unlike anything they had ever experienced, as though her personal suffering had seeped into her art. Her Violetta in La Traviata, a woman consumed by love and destroyed by it, carried echoes of her own despair. Her Tosca, jealous, vulnerable and fierce, seemed almost indistinguishable from her own spirit. Art and life had always been entwined for Callas, but now the threads were inseparable. Each performance became not only a portrayal of character, but a revelation of her own heart's turmoil. Yet the betrayals continued. Onassis, for all his charm, was incapable of fidelity. Rumors abounded of his dalliances with other women, whispers that reached Maria's ears and pierced her like daggers. She confronted him, wept, raged, pleaded, but always forgave, for every betrayal was followed by a reconciliation, every wound by a balm of tenderness, every absence by a return that reignited her hope. She lived in a cycle of passion and pain, a cycle that drained her, yet bound her ever more tightly to him. Friends and colleagues looked on with dismay. Some tried to warn her, to remind her of her greatness, to urge her not to let her art be consumed by a man's whims. But Maria was not one to live half-heartedly. Just as she had thrown her entire being into every role, so she threw herself entirely into her love for Onassis. To love less than completely was, to her, unthinkable. Even when the pain outweighed the joy, she clung to the fire, for she believed it was better to burn than to be cold. The world watched, fascinated and appalled. Newspapers printed photographs of them together, speculated on their quarrels, chronicled their reconciliations. To the public, their affair was an opera unfolding in real life, complete with passion, betrayal, and scandal. Callas, who had once commanded attention solely for her art, now found herself as famous for her love life as for her voice. The boundary between stage and life blurred until it seemed she could no longer tell the difference. One imagines her in those years, waiting in a hotel room for Onassis to arrive, the curtains drawn, the city lights flickering beyond. The telephone silent, the clock ticking, her heart aching with both hope and dread. When the door finally opened, she would rush to him, forgiving instantly whatever absence or slight had preceded his return. For in his presence, all her doubts dissolved, only to return with greater force when he left again. Such was the pattern of her devotion, endless surrender, endless longing. It is tempting to judge, to ask why she endured such pain, why she allowed herself to be diminished by a man unworthy of her greatness. But perhaps such questions miss the truth of her nature. Maria Callas was not a woman who lived for safety or compromise. She was drawn to extremes, to the edge where ecstasy and despair meet. Just as her voice revealed both beauty and harshness, her life revealed both triumph and tragedy. To live less intensely would have been, for her, no life at all. And so the tide continued to roll beneath the yacht, ceaseless, indifferent to human joy or sorrow. Maria clung to Onassis as though he were the answer to the emptiness that had haunted her since childhood. But tides are never still, and love built on conquest cannot endure. The years of passion were also the years of betrayal, and each betrayal cut deeper, leaving scars that even applause could not heal. We leave her here, on the deck once more, the sea restless beneath her, her eyes fixed on a horizon that offers no certainty. Behind her lies the glitter of triumph, before her the silence of an unopened score resting on a piano. The music waits, but her hands do not reach for it. They are clasped instead around a cigarette, the smoke curling upward, fragile and fading, like the art she is beginning to neglect in the shadow of her love. The unopened score rested on the piano, its pages silent, its notes waiting patiently for the voice that no longer came to them. Once Maria Callas would have opened it with reverence, tracing the lines of music with her eyes and shaping them with her breath until they became living fire. Now the score lay neglected, a symbol of the silence growing between her and the art that had defined her. For her devotion had turned elsewhere, away from the rigors of rehearsal halls and the harsh light of theater stages, and toward the restless figure of Aristotle Onassis, the magnate whose presence consumed her days and nights. What began as passion soon hardened into dependency. Maria, who had once commanded kings and presidents with the force of her voice, found herself orbiting the moods and whims of a single man. When he was attentive, her world felt ablaze with meaning. When he withdrew, everything around her seemed hollow, her once mighty stage reduced to shadows. She had given herself entirely to him, and in doing so, she allowed parts of herself to slip away. The applause of La Scala, the endless ovations of audiences who once wept at her performances, began to fade like distant echoes. What mattered most was whether Onassis would return her calls, whether he would keep his promises, whether he would look upon her not as one conquest among many, but as the one. To her friends, this transformation was bewildering, even tragic. They had known her as a woman of iron will, capable of defying conductors, of silencing critics, of demanding perfection with an intensity that few could endure. Now they saw her bending, yielding, forgiving endlessly the wounds inflicted by a man who could never offer her the total devotion she craved. Some pitied her, some grew impatient, some tried to intervene. But Maria, who had never listened to warnings even in her career, would not listen now. For love had become her stage, and Onassis her audience, and she could not stop performing for him. The effect on her career was undeniable. She canceled more and more engagements, citing illness or exhaustion. Tours that had once been greeted with eager anticipation were abandoned. Her voice, still capable of brilliance, began to falter under the strain of neglect and emotional turmoil. Critics who had once marveled at her intensity now spoke of decline, of inconsistency, of a diva who had lost her discipline. Yet even in this decline, flashes of her genius remained, moments when the old fire broke through and left audiences shaken. These moments were enough to sustain her legend, but they became rarer, like sparks in fading embers. Still, she clung to Onassis. Her identity, once rooted firmly in her art, shifted dangerously toward him. She measured her worth not in ovations, but in his attention. When he brought her to his yacht, when he introduced her to the powerful and wealthy who surrounded him, she felt elevated, adorned, a queen beside a king. Yet beneath the glitter lay an emptiness. For in those gatherings, she was not always the center, not always the divine figure she'd been on stage. She was simply a woman among others, competing for the gaze of a man whose appetite for conquest knew no bounds. This dependency ate away at her spirit. She who had once been untouchable on stage became fragile in life. She endured slights, tolerated betrayals, forgave humiliations, all in the hope that Onassis would finally choose her completely. But he never did. His love, if love it was partial, pragmatic, shaped by desire and convenience. To him, Maria was extraordinary but not indispensable. To her, he was indispensable, even when he wounded her. The world, of course, watched with fascination. The newspapers that had once chronicled her scandals on stage now chronicled her scandals in love. Photographs of her with Onassis were printed alongside headlines that speculated about their future. Would he marry her? Would she retire for him? Would the diva abandon her art for the magnate? The questions hung in the air, unanswered, feeding the opera of gossip that surrounded her life. Maria, once mistress of her own myth, now found herself trapped within it. And yet, through it all, she remained devoted. Even as she withdrew from the stage, even as her voice grew uncertain, even as Onassis betrayed her again and again, she held to him with the tenacity of one who cannot bear to lose the last hope of fulfillment. Perhaps she believed that her love could transform him, as her art had transformed music. Perhaps she believed that the devotion she offered so completely must, in time, be returned. Or perhaps she simply feared the emptiness that would remain if she let him go. For Maria Callas was not a woman who could live without fire, and even destructive fire was better than none. One imagines her in those years, seated in a salon on one of Onassis's yachts, surrounded by laughter, the clinking of glasses, the murmurs of deals and intrigues. She sits slightly apart, her eyes luminous, her smile subdued, waiting for his glance. When it comes, her heart lifts. When it does not, she sinks into silence. Nearby, a piano waits, its lid closed, the keys untouched. Once she would have opened it, filled the room with sound, reminded them all who she was. Now she waits for him instead, the silence louder than any music. The unopened score on the piano becomes a haunting image of these years, for it represents not only neglect, but also possibility, the art still waiting within her, the greatness still hers if she chose to reclaim it. But the longer it remained unopened, the heavier it became, until it seemed less like a book of music and more like a coffin of silence. Thus, the diva who had redefined opera allowed herself to be defined by a man. Not entirely, not forever, but enough to weaken the flame that had once burned unquenchable. The tragedy of Maria Callas is not only that she loved unwisely, but that she loved completely, with the same totality that made her art transcendent. She could not live in halves, could not give herself partially. To music, she had given everything. To Onassis, she gave everything again. And in that giving, she risked losing herself. And so we leave her here, the unopened score still resting on the piano, the room heavy with perfume and smoke, the sound of laughter drifting in from another room where Onassis entertains his guests. Maria sits quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting. Outside, in the corridor, a door slams shut, Heavy, final, the sound of abandonment that will soon come to define her. The door slammed shut, its sound echoing with the weight of finality. And in that echo lay the foreshadowing of the greatest wound Maria Callas would ever endure. For the man to whom she had given herself completely, the man for whom she had sacrificed the safety of her marriage and the security of her art, would turn away from her with a swiftness that seemed almost cruel in its simplicity. Aristotle Onassis, whose laughter had filled her nights and whose absence had hollowed her days, chose another, and not merely another, but one whose name and face would be emblazoned across the world, Jacqueline Kennedy, widow of the slain American president, symbol of glamour, tragedy, and power. The announcement in 1968 of Onassis' marriage to Jacqueline was more than betrayal. It was devastation. For Maria, it was as though the ground beneath her feet had given way. She had endured his infidelities, forgiven his wanderings, excused his cruelties, always believing that at last he would return to her, that in the end her devotion would be rewarded. To see him wed another, and so publicly, was to be confronted with the harsh truth that her love had not been enough to bind him. The world, ever eager for spectacle, devoured the story. Newspapers that had once chronicled her triumphs now chronicled her humiliation. Photographs of Onassis and Jacqueline together, radiant and smiling, filled the pages of magazines that once displayed Maria's image. Admirers pitied her, critics mocked her, and the gossip columns dissected her sorrow with a coldness that cut more deeply than any review. She was no longer only La Divina, but also the abandoned woman, the diva left behind for a younger, fresher icon. In her Paris apartment, Maria retreated into silence. Friends who visited spoke of her sitting for hours in solitude, the curtains drawn, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the room, as if searching for a sound that would not come. She still loved him, even then. In her heart, she clung to the hope that he might return, that the marriage to Jacqueline was a mistake, a passing dalliance in his restless life. And indeed, Onassis did return to her at times, slipping back into her orbit in moments of weakness, unable to sever entirely the bond they shared, but he never returned fully. His heart, if it had ever been hers, was divided, and Maria knew it. The abandonment cut more deeply than any failure on stage, for on stage she had always known how to rise again, how to redeem a faltering note with a phrase of fire, how to turn jeers into bravos with the force of her truth. But in love, she had no such power. She could not transform betrayal into triumph, could not transmute absence into presence. The applause of audiences could not console her now, for what she had lost was not admiration but intimacy, the sense of being chosen, of being loved without condition. Her art, already weakened by years of neglect, suffered further. She attempted to return to the stage, to reclaim her place among the greats, but the voice that had once burned with such brilliance now faltered. Audiences who had once wept for her now wept for what she had lost. Some applauded out of loyalty, others out of pity, but the magic that had once seemed inexhaustible now flickered uncertainly. Maria, who demanded perfection from herself, was tormented by her own decline. She heard the flaws others heard, and they wounded her like knives. Each performance became a battlefield, each note a struggle, and she who had once embodied heroines now seemed herself a tragic heroine, undone not by enemies, but by time, love, and sorrow. And yet, even in decline, she remained extraordinary. Those who witnessed her late performances spoke of moments when the old flame returned, when her voice cracked open with such raw emotion that it silenced all criticism. She was no longer flawless, but she was more human than ever, and in that humanity lay a different kind of greatness. Still, for Maria herself, these moments could not console. She longed not for admiration, but for the embrace of the man who had turned away. It is tempting to see in her story a pattern written long before. The child neglected by her mother, always seeking unconditional love, always denied it. In Onassis, she had sought to heal that wound, to find at last the devotion she had never known. But the pattern repeated. The wound reopened, and the abandonment she had feared all her life became real. Perhaps this is why her art had always carried such truth, for she sang not only the roles of betrayed heroines, but her own fate, even before it had unfolded. One can imagine her in those years, alone in her Paris apartment, the piano closed, the telephone silent, her face illuminated only by the glow of a single lamp. On the table beside her lay magazines with photographs of Onassis and Jacqueline, their smiles radiant, their lives entwined. Maria would turn the pages slowly, her fingers lingering on the images, her eyes searching them as though for clues, as though they might reveal why he had chosen another. The silence of the room pressed upon her, broken only by the faint hum of the city outside, a reminder that life continued even as hers seemed suspended in sorrow. And yet, she endured. She continued to live, to sing occasionally, to receive visitors, to smile for cameras when required. She did not collapse entirely, though part of her spirit had been shattered. She carried on with the dignity of one who knows that her name will outlast her sorrow, even if her heart will never be mended. For Maria Callas was always two women, the diva who belonged to the world and the woman who longed simply to be loved. The world still adored the diva, but the woman sat alone, abandoned. The sound of the slam door lingered in her memory, but now it was joined by another sound, the screech of a microphone feeding back during one of her attempted comebacks, a harsh noise that echoed the fracture of her voice and the fracture of her life. It was as though the very technology meant to amplify her had betrayed her, just as love had. That screech, sharp and unresolved, would carry her into the years of attempted return, when applause and pity mingled uneasily in the halls where she once reigned supreme. The screech of the microphone pierced the air, a sound jagged and unmusical, as though the very tools meant to carry her voice had turned against her. It was a fitting emblem for the years of Maria Callas's attempted return, when the world that had once crowned her now listened with ambivalence, unsure whether they were hearing a miracle reborn or the slow unraveling of a legend. For Callas, these attempts were both necessary and tormenting. Necessary because the stage had been her life's breath, tormenting because her voice, once sovereign, now betrayed her with cruel irregularity. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Maria, already wounded by the abandonment of Onassis and the decline of her powers, sought to re-enter the world that had once been hers. With Giuseppe Di Stefano, her longtime colleague and sometime confidant, she embarked on a series of concert tours. The pairing seemed promising. Two great voices of their generation, reunited in middle age, offering audiences the chance to witness history once more. For Maria, it was also a way of reclaiming a part of herself she had lost, to prove that she was still more than the abandoned woman, still more than the faded photograph. But the reality was crueler. Di Stefano, himself past his prime, struggled with his own vocal decline, and together they presented audiences not with the perfection of their youth, but with the poignancy of what once had been. At times, Maria's voice still flared with the old fire, a note that cut through with piercing clarity, a phrase that carried the weight of truth, a moment that silenced doubters. But just as often, the voice cracked, faltered, fell short. Audiences caught between loyalty and honesty applauded nonetheless, some out of devotion, some out of pity, some out of a desperate wish to hear again what could no longer be sustained. Maria herself was painfully aware of every flaw. She had always been her own harshest critic, and now, as her voice betrayed her, she suffered deeply. After performances, she would withdraw into silence, her eyes shadowed, her face set in lines of sorrow. To those closest to her, she confessed that she knew she was no longer what she had been, that the instrument which had carried her genius was slipping away. Yet she continued, because to stop entirely would have been to admit defeat, to accept that the voice which had once defined her had become silent forever. The tours drew large crowds, but the atmosphere was different from the fervor of her earlier triumphs. Then, audiences had come to be shaken, to be dazzled, to be torn apart by the force of her truth. Now they came to remember, to pay homage, to bear witness to the decline of a goddess. Some wept not from the power of her singing, but from the memory of what she had been, the ghost of her former glory haunting every phrase. Critics were divided, some generous, emphasizing the lingering brilliance of her interpretation, others merciless, describing her as a shadow of herself. Maria read the words, and each one cut deeper than the last. And yet there is something in these final attempts that deserves reverence, for they revealed not only decline but courage, to step once more before an audience, knowing that her voice might falter, knowing that she would be judged harshly, required a strength as great as any triumph. She stood before the world with her vulnerabilities laid bare, offering not perfection but humanity. In those cracked notes, in those faltering phrases, one could hear the truth of a life lived in extremes, the cost of giving oneself entirely to art and to love. The partnership with Di Stefano was also tinged with personal affection. They had sung together in earlier years, and their bond, though complicated, carried warmth. On stage, even as their voices struggled, their gazes revealed camaraderie, a shared memory of what they once had been. For audiences, this too carried poignancy. It was not only a concert, but a reunion of two figures who had once defined an era. The sight of them together, older, fragile, yet still striving, became a kind of living elegy for opera itself. But Maria could not escape the torment of comparison. Each time she opened her mouth, she heard within herself the echo of what she had been, the greatness that had once flowed effortlessly. To live in that contrast was agony. She once said that the worst part of decline was not that others noticed, but that she noticed most of all. She, who had demanded absolute truth from herself, could not bear the truth of her own fading powers. And yet, she sang. One can imagine her after one of those concerts, the applause still ringing, the flowers still fresh, yet her face set in sorrow. She returns to her dressing room, the mirror reflecting not only her image, but the memory of the woman she once was. She removes her makeup slowly, the rouge and powder dissolving into tissue, as though erasing the last traces of divinity. The silence of the room presses in, broken only by the faint hum of the microphone, still vibrating with feedback, its shriek a reminder of betrayal. Did she feel comforted by the devotion of her audience, or did she feel mocked by their pity? Perhaps both, for her life was always lived in contradictions. These years of attempted return revealed something essential about Maria Callas, that she was incapable of giving less than all. Even when her voice faltered, she gave her heart, her soul, her truth. And in that truth there was greatness still, though it was no longer the greatness of flawless sound, but the greatness of vulnerability. Her audiences, if they listened closely, could hear not only the music, but the life behind it, the hunger of childhood, the triumph of La Scala, the passion of Onassis, the sorrow of abandonment. Every cracked note carried the weight of all she had endured. But such courage could not last forever. The strain of these tours wore her down further, physically and emotionally. By the mid-1970s, her public appearances grew fewer, her voice more fragile, her spirit more withdrawn. The attempts at return had not restored her to glory, but they had given her a kind of closure, a final chance to stand before the world and say, "I am still here, even if not as I was." Afterward, silence awaited, and so we leave her here, at the end of a concert tour, the applause fading into the distance, the microphone's screech still echoing faintly. The stage is empty now, the piano lid closed, the hall darkened. Maria walks alone through a quiet corridor, her footsteps soft against the worn carpet, until she reaches a door that opens onto her Paris apartment. Inside, the air is still, the piano untouched, a single candle flickering on a table. Its flame trembles uncertainly, casting long shadows on the walls, as though it too is nearing extinction. The candle flame trembled, casting shadows that danced uncertainly along the walls of her Paris apartment. It was a fragile light, its glow reaching only a short distance before surrendering to the dark, as though echoing the life of Maria Callas in those final years. Once her presence had filled theaters with brilliance, her voice carrying across continents, her name whispered with reverence. Now she lived in rooms dimly lit, her world reduced to silence and memory, her only companions a handful of loyal visitors, a few devoted friends, and the ghosts of applause that no longer came. Paris had always been a city of refinement, a place of artists and dreamers, where the air itself seemed perfumed with history. But for Maria, the Paris of the 1970s was not a city of light, but of retreat. After the faltering tours with Giuseppe Di Stefano, after the abandonment of Onassis, after the years of scandal and decline, she withdrew into an apartment on Avenue Georges Mandel, where curtains were often drawn, and the outside world was kept at bay. To her neighbors, she was a quiet presence, glimpsed occasionally, her figure elegant but increasingly fragile. To the world, she had become a myth, glimpsed only through rumor, as if she had slipped into another realm, half living, half remembered. Inside the apartment, the silence was deep. She no longer opened the scores that once had guided her days. The piano stood unused, its keys untouched except for moments when her hands wandered over them absently, producing fragments of melodies that drifted into the air like half-forgotten dreams. Visitors recalled hearing her sing softly to herself now and then, not in full voice but in murmurs, as though speaking to the music rather than performing it. These moments were brief, fragile, like the candle flame that flickered uncertainly before extinguishing. Her solitude was not complete, for she was not abandoned by all. A few friends came faithfully. Giovanni Battista Meneghini, though hurt by her leaving, remained loyal from a distance. Giuseppe Di Stefano visited at times, and younger admirers sought her guidance, hoping to learn from the legend. But Maria, though gracious, remained guarded. The betrayals of life had left her cautious, her trust worn thin. She welcomed companionship, yet she seemed always to hold a part of herself back, as if to protect the wounded heart that could no longer bear to be broken again. The rumors, meanwhile, multiplied. The press, which had never tired of her, continued to speculate about her life behind those drawn curtains. Was she ill? Was she destitute? Had she borne a child with Onassis, a child lost to secrecy or tragedy? None of these questions were ever answered fully, and perhaps it is best that they were not. For Callas lived in mystery as much as in fact, and the ambiguity of her later years became part of her myth. She was seen less and less, and in that absence, imaginations filled the void. Yet even in solitude, she remained a figure of elegance. Photographs from the time show her still poised, her face refined, her gaze deep. Though the fire of earlier years had softened into melancholy, She carried herself with dignity, as though aware that even in retreat she was still being watched, still embodying a role. But behind the poise lay loneliness, and those who visited spoke of a sadness that lingered in the air, a sense of longing that no companionship could ease. She had lived for passion, and passion had abandoned her. She had lived for art, and art had slipped away. What remained was silence, heavy and unyielding. It is tempting to see these years as a descent, a slow fading into irrelevance, but perhaps there is another way to understand them. For in her solitude, Callas embodied something universal, the inevitability of decline, the loneliness that follows greatness, the quiet that comes after storms. She had lived at the extremes, and now she lived in the shadow of those extremes. There is dignity, even truth, in that. Her life was no longer a stage, but it remained a story, one that spoke of the cost of greatness, the fragility of love, the solitude that even the most adored cannot escape. One imagines her late at night, seated in her apartment with a cup of tea gone cold, the city murmuring faintly beyond the windows. The candle flickers beside her, its wax dripping slowly, the flame bending with each draft of air. She opens a book but does not read, her eyes fixed instead on the candle itself, as though its fragile light mirrored her own life, still burning but unsteady, vulnerable, nearing its end. In such moments, did she regret the choices she had made? Did she wish she had remained with Meneghini, secure if unfulfilled? Did she wish she had guarded her voice more carefully, preserved her career more jealously? Or did she accept that she could not have lived otherwise, that her passion, her extremes, were as much a part of her as her voice? Perhaps she knew that her life, though tragic, was also true. She had lived fully, burned brightly, given herself without reserve to both art and love. Few could claim as much. And if the cost was solitude in a Paris apartment, perhaps it was a price she was destined to pay. The candle, by now, gutters lower, its flame shrinking. Soon it will vanish, leaving only smoke curling upward. But before it dies, it casts a final wavering light upon the walls, revealing for a moment not the solitude of Callas, but the echoes of her rivals, her contemporaries, her companions in art. Among them, the figure of Renata Tebaldi appears in memory, her voice still serene, her path different yet intertwined. The comparison had haunted Maria in life. In solitude, it still lingered. The flame flickers again, and in its light, two voices seem to mingle, distant, fading, yet forever entwined. The two fading voices lingered in the wavering light, woven together like threads of memory that refused to part. Once they had been cast against one another, set up by the world as combatants in a contest of sound, Maria Callas and Renata Tebaldi, flame and angel, storm and serenity. Now, in the quiet of Maria's Paris solitude, the rivalry seemed less like a battle and more like an echo, a duet sung from a distance, softened by time until the edges blurred and the bitterness dissolved into something gentler, almost tender. The rivalry had been born not entirely of the women themselves, but of those who surrounded them. The press, the fans, the critics, each found in their contrast a narrative too enticing to resist. Callas, with her jagged, searing truth, and Tebaldi, with her smooth, radiant beauty, seemed destined to be weighed against each other. Their careers overlapped in an era when opera still commanded international attention, and audiences longed for sides to choose, heroes and heroines to defend. Thus the Callas-Tebaldi rivalry became legend, a theater beyond the theater, a story played out not only on stages, but in newspapers, salons, and whispered debates. In those days, Maria had bristled under the comparisons. Every compliment to Tebaldi felt like a wound to her. Every description of Tebaldi's voice as angelic seemed to imply that hers was demonic. Her insecurity, sharpened by childhood wounds and later betrayals, made her especially vulnerable to the rivalry. She could not easily dismiss it, could not simply accept that different kinds of beauty could coexist. She fought, sometimes with sharp words, sometimes with icy silences, her pride unable to bear the thought of being overshadowed. Tebaldi, for her part, often appeared more gracious, less consumed by the feud, though she too must have felt its weight, for no artist can be compared endlessly without weariness. But as the years passed, and as both women aged, the rivalry softened. They began to speak more kindly of each other, acknowledging what the world had insisted on denying, that both were great, each in her own way. Maria, reflecting in later interviews, conceded Tebaldi's beauty of tone, while Tebaldi admitted the dramatic truth of Callas's interpretations. It was as though time itself had stripped away the need for competition, leaving behind only the recognition of shared destiny. For in the end, both had carried the burden of divinity. Both had been exalted and judged. Both had known the loneliness of being placed upon a pedestal. For Maria, in her solitude, the echo of Tebaldi's voice was no longer a threat, but a companion. In the silence of her Paris apartment, where her own voice rarely rose beyond a whisper, the memory of her rival's angelic sound might have seemed a comfort, a reminder that she had not been alone in bearing the crown of greatness. Rivalries are born of youth and ambition, but in age they often reveal themselves as mirrors, each woman reflecting the other's struggle, each bound by the same fate of applause and decline. It is possible to imagine Maria late at night, a record spinning on her turntable, Tebaldi's voice flowing from the grooves. Did she listen with envy or with peace? Did she recall the sharpness of their earlier years, or did she allow herself to hear only the beauty of the sound, freed from comparison? Perhaps she wondered if the rivalry had ever truly mattered, if the world had made of their differences something greater than they themselves had felt. Perhaps she realized in those quiet hours that her true rival had never been Tebaldi but herself, her own insecurities, her own need for perfection, her own hunger for love. The irony of their rivalry is that it outlived them both, continuing in debates among fans long after the women themselves had softened toward each other. Even today, admirers ask, Callas or Tebaldi, fire or angel, truth or beauty? Yet the question misses the deeper truth, that art is not a contest, and that the greatness of each was made more luminous by the contrast of the other. Without Tebaldi's smooth serenity, Callas's fire might have seemed too harsh. Without Callas's jagged truth, Tebaldi's beauty might have seemed too safe. Together they embodied the fullness of opera's possibilities, and together they shaped an era that no longer exists. For Maria, the echo of Tebaldi's voice in her later years may have carried not rivalry, but reconciliation. In Tebaldi's fate, she might have seen her own, two women who had given themselves entirely to music, who had carried the burden of divinity, who had known both triumph and loneliness. If they were rivals, it was only because they were alike in ways the world could not see. One imagines Maria, seated once more in her quiet apartment, the candle now extinguished, the shadows deep. From the gramophone comes Tebaldi's voice, serene and radiant, filling the silence. Maria closes her eyes, listening not with envy but with recognition, as though hearing not another woman but a different reflection of herself. The record spins, the needle tracing its endless circle, the sound fading slowly as the grooves wear thin. And in that fading, another image arises, a blurred photograph placed face down on a table, its details obscured, its subject uncertain. Rumors and shadows surround it, stories of lost health, of secret children, of mysteries never resolved. The rivalry has softened into memory, but new murmurs stir, new uncertainties that blur the line between truth and myth in Maria's life. The photograph lies silent, waiting for someone to turn it over, waiting for questions that may never be answered. The photograph lay face down on the table, its blurred outlines hidden from view, its silence inviting questions that could never be fully answered. Around such silences, myths are born, and around Maria Callas in her final years, myths multiplied like shadows in a fading room. She was no longer constantly seen, no longer constantly heard, and in that absence, the imagination of others grew restless. Where facts fell away, whispers rose in their place, weaving a tapestry of rumor and speculation that blurred the borders between truth and invention. There were whispers of her health, of a body worn thin by years of sacrifice. Some said she suffered from mysterious illnesses, from the after effects of parasites, or from the toll of her drastic transformation. Others claimed she was addicted to pills, that she used them to calm her nerves, to induce sleep, to quiet the restlessness that consumed her nights. Doctors gave different accounts, friends offered fragments of testimony, but no single story prevailed. The truth perhaps lay in the convergence of all. A body once so strong, now fragile. A woman once so commanding, now diminished, not by one cause but by many. There were whispers, too, of a secret child born of her love with Onassis. Some swore that she had carried his son, that the child was lost, hidden, or abandoned. Others dismissed it as invention, a tale conjured by those who could not resist adding further drama to an already operatic life. Maria herself never confirmed nor denied the stories, and perhaps that was why they endured. The possibility of a lost child seemed to fit her story too well. The great Diva, betrayed in love, left not only abandoned, but bereaved. Whether true or false, the rumor carried the weight of myth, adding another layer to her tragic legend. And then there were the murmurs of her decline, of how she spent her final years in solitude, haunted by memories, her days filled with silence, her nights with ghosts. Some spoke of her wandering her Paris apartment aimlessly, her once sharp eyes dulled by melancholy. Others claimed she still carried herself with poise, her elegance undiminished, her conversation still brilliant when she chose to engage, which was true, perhaps both. For Maria was always two women, the goddess and the mortal, the diva and the wounded soul. In solitude, these halves did not vanish. They coexisted uneasily, shifting like shadows with the movement of light. The world outside continued to speculate because the world could not bear to let her fade quietly. She had been too bright, too consuming a figure to be allowed a gentle decline. Her fans demanded explanations, her detractors demanded proof of her fall, and the press continued to circle, hungry for glimpses behind the curtains of Avenue Georges Mandel. Each rumor, each story, each blurred photograph became part of the myth of her final years, a myth as operatic as the roles she had once embodied. Yet what did Maria herself think of these murmurs? Did she read the stories? Did she care? Those who visited her said she alternated between irritation and indifference. Sometimes she laughed at the absurdity of the tales, other times she seemed wounded by the intrusion. But most often, she retreated into silence, unwilling to fight, unwilling to confirm or deny. Perhaps she knew that myths, once born, cannot be undone. Perhaps she understood that her life, like her art, would always be larger than fact, always reshaped by the imaginations of others. What is certain is that she remained haunted. The loss of Onassis, the decline of her voice, the betrayals of friends and lovers, all weighed upon her. She spoke often of loneliness, of how the world adored her on stage but left her alone in life. Her apartment became a sanctuary but also a prison, filled with memories she could not escape. She listened sometimes to her old recordings, her own voice flowing back to her from the past, a reminder of what she had been. Did she take pride in it, or did it wound her further? To hear oneself young and glorious while sitting alone in age must be a strange torment, both a consolation and a sorrow. In this loneliness, the line between memory and myth grew thin. Maria herself may not have known where truth ended and rumor began, for memory itself becomes uncertain when carried alone. Did she sometimes believe the stories told about her? Did she imagine the child she never confirmed, the health she never explained, the betrayals she never resolved? Perhaps she did, for in solitude, one begins to live as much in imagination as in fact, and Maria Callas was, above all, a woman of imagination, one who turned life into drama, even when the curtain was closed. One imagines her, late at night, standing before a blurred photograph in her apartment. She lifts it, looks upon it, sees a face half hidden in shadow. Is it Onassis? Is it herself? Is it someone else altogether? She turns it over slowly, then sets it down again, face down, leaving the mystery unresolved. Around her, the silence hums like an unanswered question, and in that silence, the myths multiply. But myths, for all their shadows, are not without truth. They may not describe facts, but they reveal meanings. The whispers of Maria's health, her lost child, her solitude, all speak to the deeper truth of her life, that she was a woman consumed by extremes, a woman who gave herself so completely that little remained for herself in the end. Whether the stories were true or false matters less than the way they reflected her essence, her tragedy, her greatness. And so, the blurred photograph remains face down, its image unseen, its questions unanswered. The candle is long extinguished, the gramophone silent, the piano untouched. In the stillness, the room seems almost like a tomb, though its occupant still breathes. Outside, Paris moves on, its streets alive with laughter, its cafes buzzing with talk. Inside, Maria Callas waits in silence, her life already turning into legend even before its end. It is here we leave her amid shadows and whispers, surrounded not by applause but by unanswered questions. The blurred photograph lies still, the room heavy with silence until at last another sound intrudes, the finality of a closed casket, the stillness of death, the silence that follows when even myths can no longer be spoken by their subject. The sound of the casket closing was final, its heavy thud reverberating like the closing of a curtain after the last act. On September 16, 1977, in her Paris apartment on Avenue Georges Mandel, Maria Callas died at the age of 53. The city outside bustled as always. Cars moved along the boulevards, footsteps echoed on pavements, cafes hummed with conversation. But inside those rooms, silence reigned. The voice that had once commanded the world had fallen still. The cause of her death was recorded as a heart attack, though whispers immediately began to stir, as they always had in her life. Some suggested she had been weakened by years of tranquilizers and sleeping pills, substances she had used to quiet her nerves and silence her restless nights. Others speculated about deeper mysteries, a broken heart, a deliberate withdrawal, even a quiet surrender to despair. The truth may have been simple. Her body, strained by years of sacrifice, gave out. But the myth demanded more, demanded ambiguity, demanded that her passing, like her life, be tinged with tragedy and unanswered questions. Her death shocked the world. She had lived for only 53 years, an age that seemed far too brief for one who had burned so brightly. Admirers who had followed her career wept openly, remembering the moments when her voice had pierced their souls. Critics, who had once judged her harshly, softened their tone, acknowledging her as the greatest soprano of her time, perhaps of all time. The news spread quickly. from Paris to New York, from Athens to Milan, from the boulevards to the opera houses. The diva was gone, and the silence she left behind felt heavier than applause. In her apartment, those who entered after her death found a space that reflected her solitude. The piano stood closed, dust on its keys. Scores lay unopened on shelves, reminders of music that had once been her lifeblood. Photographs of her past, smiling beside Onassis, radiant on stage, poised in gowns, sat framed on tables, silent witnesses to a life lived in extremes. The rooms were orderly, elegant, but infused with melancholy, as though they had been waiting for her departure. Her funeral was held in Paris, attended by friends, admirers, and those who had once shared her life. The service was dignified but subdued, lacking the grandeur one might expect for a woman of such fame. There were no thunderous ovations, no curtains rising on an aria, only prayers whispered and tears shed quietly. Later, her ashes were placed in the Père Lachaise cemetery, near the graves of other artists and dreamers. But even in death, Callas could not escape uncertainty. Some years later, her remains were stolen and then recovered, as if even her ashes were fated to be caught in the drama of myth. Eventually, they were scattered in the Aegean Sea, near her beloved Greece. Her voice returned to the waters that had once carried her from New York to Athens, from Athens to Italy, from Italy to the world. What was left behind was not only silence but questions. Did Maria Callas die of illness or of heartbreak? Did she succumb to the weight of loneliness, or did her body simply fail after years of strain? Did she, as some romantically claimed, die because Onassis no longer lived, he himself having died in 1975, 2 years before her? Perhaps the simplest answer is that she died as she had lived, consumed by passion, burdened by wounds, unable to separate her body from her soul. Her death also revealed the paradox of her existence, for though her body was gone, her voice remained. Recordings of her performances continued to circulate, her interpretations still unmatched. To hear her Norma, her Tosca, her Medea, even after her death, was to feel her presence again, alive, raw, commanding. The silence of her apartment was offset by the sound of her voice playing on turntables across the world, as if she had conquered death by leaving behind a part of herself that could never be extinguished. And yet, recordings are not the same as life. Those who had heard her in person spoke of something that could not be captured fully in grooves of vinyl. The electricity of her presence, the way her voice in the theater seemed to pierce the air and the heart simultaneously. For them, her death was not only the loss of a woman, but the loss of an experience that could never be repeated. Opera houses mourn not only her, but the era she embodied, an era when singers were more than performers. They were gods and goddesses, shaping lives with sound. For Maria herself, perhaps death was a release. She had endured loneliness, betrayal, decline, and endless scrutiny, and she had lived with the torment of knowing what she had been and what she had lost. To slip into silence may have been, in its way, a relief. The questions, the rumors, the comparisons, all ceased. Only the memory remained, and memory, unlike life, can be softened, idealized, preserved in beauty. One imagines her spirit not in the Paris apartment, but upon the Aegean waters, where her ashes were scattered. The sea that had once carried her through exile, through triumph, through passion, now received her quietly. The waves rolled, indifferent yet eternal, their rhythms steady, carrying her into infinity. For a woman who had lived between nations, between worlds, the sea was a fitting resting place, borderless, restless, endless. And so the casket closes, the ashes scatter, the silence deepens. But from that silence, another sound emerges, not from her body, not from her lips, but from the black grooves of a record spinning gently on a turntable. The needle lowers, a faint crackle begins, and then her voice rises once more, soaring, fragile, indomitable. Death has stilled her, but the recordings defy it, keeping her alive in sound, alive in memory. We leave her here, between silence and song, between the closed casket and the spinning record. The room is quiet, the turntable hums softly, the needle circles endlessly. From the speakers, her voice fills the air, rising against the silence, defying the finality of death. The record spun gently, the faint crackle of the needle rising like the sound of distant rain, and then her voice emerged, filling the air as though it had never ceased. In that moment, Maria Callas lived again, not as the solitary figure in her Paris apartment, not as the woman wounded by love and betrayal, but as La Divina, the goddess of sound who could pierce the soul. Death had closed her eyes, but it had not silenced her. The grooves of vinyl carried her back again and again, each replay a resurrection, each aria an act of defiance against the silence of the grave. There was a paradox in this afterlife of sound. In her final years, Maria had been nearly invisible, her world reduced to shadows, her voice seldom raised even within her own walls. Yet in death, she became more present than ever. Recordings circulated across continents, reaching new generations who had never seen her on stage. Young listeners discovered her through the hiss of turntables, marveling at the intensity of a voice unlike any other. Old admirers wept as they listened, recalling nights in La Scala, in Covent Garden, in the Metropolitan Opera, when her voice had held them spellbound. In life, she had been mortal, vulnerable, wounded. In death, she became eternal, preserved in sound, her flaws and her brilliance alike captured forever. Her recordings carried a quality that others could not replicate. It was not only the accuracy of notes or the beauty of tone, but the truth behind them. In every phrase, one could hear the struggle, the hunger, the despair, the triumph. Her Norma revealed a priestess torn apart by love and duty, but it also revealed Maria herself, torn by the same contradictions. Her Medea thundered with vengeance, but it also thundered with her own rage at betrayal. Her Tosca bled with jealousy and passion, but it also bled with her own longing for devotion. Unlike many singers, she did not hide behind roles. She exposed herself through them. And so, when her recordings played after her death, listeners did not hear only art. They heard life itself, transmuted into sound. In this way, Maria Callas became more alive in memory than she had been in her final solitude. The woman who had sat alone in a Paris apartment now lived in the hearts of millions. Each time the needle dropped onto a record, each time a voice rose from speakers or radios, she was summoned back into the present. She was no longer bound by time, no longer diminished by decline. She was immortal, not in body, not in presence, but in resonance. But immortality is also a burden, for in preserving her voice, recordings also preserve the contrasts, the rough edges, the imperfections, the cracks that others had criticized. Some still debated her, arguing whether she was truly the greatest, whether her flaws outweighed her genius. The rivalry with Tebaldi lived on in recordings, each listener choosing between the angel and the flame. Critics dissected her phrasing, her tone, her choices, as though she were still alive to be judged. In this sense, Maria Callas never escaped scrutiny, even beyond death. Yet perhaps this was fitting, for her art had always lived in tension, in contradiction, in imperfection transformed into truth. To be remembered without debate would have been to be remembered falsely. One imagines a room years after her death, a gramophone spinning in the half-light, her voice filling the air. A listener sits quietly, eyes closed, transported not only to the theater of sound, but to the theater of her life. The listener hears not just the music, but the woman behind it. The child singing in a New York apartment, the young soprano in Athens during wartime, the diva at La Scala, the lover on Onassis' yacht, the solitary figure in Paris. All of these lives are carried in the voice, woven into its fabric, inseparable from its sound. In that moment, Maria Callas is more than a singer. She is memory itself, a vessel of human experience captured in vibration. It is said that voices linger even after the body is gone, that sound waves, once released, never truly disappear, but continue to echo faintly through the universe. If that is so, then Maria Callas's voice still travels through the air, carried on winds, mingling with the sounds of the world. Somewhere, perhaps, the echoes of her Costa Diva still float above the ruins of Athens, or her Vici d'arte still trembles in the rafters of La Scala. Her recordings may be finite, but the sound itself is infinite, never fully silenced, always lingering. And yet, for all her immortality, the sadness remains. To hear her voice is to be reminded not only of her greatness, but of her tragedy. The recordings preserve her, but they also preserve the wounds, the longing, the heartbreak, the loneliness. They remind us that genius and despair are often inseparable, that art is born from suffering as much as from joy. In this sense, her immortality is bittersweet, for it ensures that she will always be remembered, but also that she will always be remembered as tragic. Still, perhaps this is fitting, for Maria Callas was never meant to be ordinary, never meant to fade gently into obscurity. She lived in extremes, and her legacy lives in extremes. She is remembered not as a flawless singer, but as the greatest interpreter, not as a saint, but as a woman who lived and loved with devastating intensity. Her immortality is not one of perfection, but of truth, and truth endures longer than beauty. The record continues to spin, the needle tracing its circle, her voice rising and falling, the faint crackle of static reminding us of the distance between life and memory. And as it spins, the listener leans closer, not wanting the aria to end, not wanting the silence to return. But all records end, all arias conclude, all voices fade. The needle lifts, the turntable slows, the sound diminishes, leaving only silence. And in that silence lies a question, one that no recording can answer. Was Maria Callas, in the end, a triumph or a tragedy? Was she divine, or was she broken? Was she remembered for her genius, or for her despair? The record cannot tell us. It leaves us with only the paradox, unresolved, lingering like an unfinished phrase. We leave her here, her voice fading into silence, the record's needle lifted, the turntable humming faintly as it slows. The room grows still once more, and in that stillness there is space for reflection, for the eternal question that hovers over her legacy. The silence waits as though inviting an answer, as though preparing for one final part of the story. The silence that followed the lifted needle lingered, heavy and unresolved, as though the very air waited for an answer that would not come. In that silence lay the essence of Maria Callas's legacy, not certainty but ambiguity, not resolution, but questions that drift like smoke long after the flame is gone. Was she, as some claimed, the greatest soprano of the 20th century, the woman who redefined opera through her truth and intensity? Or was she a figure undone by her own passions, a tragic heroine who lived her roles too fully until life itself became indistinguishable from the stage? Her admirers speak of her as La Divina, the divine one, whose artistry elevated opera to a realm it had never known before. They remember the fire of her Norma, the fragility of her Lucia, the ferocity of her Medea. They speak of nights when her voice seemed to stop time, when entire theaters held their breath as if caught in her spell. They argue that her genius lay not in perfection, but in her willingness to risk everything, to strip away beauty in pursuit of truth. And in this, she was unmatched. Her critics, however, point to the flaws, the unevenness of her tone, the cracks in her later years, the temperamental scandals that overshadowed her art. They argue that her decline was as much her own making as it was fate's, that she squandered her gift for the sake of passion, that she lived not as an artist should, but as a woman consumed by weakness. To them, her story is not one of triumph, but of waste, a flame that burned too hot and too quickly. But perhaps both are true, and perhaps that is why she endures. For Maria, Callas was never one thing alone. She was brilliance and brokenness, ecstasy and despair, divinity and fragility. Her life cannot be neatly categorized. Her legacy cannot be reduced to either triumph or tragedy. She was all of these at once, and it was this very multiplicity that made her unforgettable. To hear her voice is to hear contradictions held together, strength and vulnerability, precision and wildness, beauty and harshness. To know her story is to see how art and life can mirror each other so completely that they become inseparable. Her legacy also raises questions beyond herself. What does it mean to be great? Is greatness the pursuit of perfection, or is it the willingness to reveal imperfection with honesty? Is an artist greater for their longevity, for the consistency of their work, or for the brilliance of moments that burn so intensely they sear themselves into memory? Maria's life suggests that greatness may not lie in balance or endurance, but in extremes. She gave herself entirely, without reserve, and in doing so, she left behind not a smooth, unbroken line, but a jagged flame that continues to blaze. And what of love? Was her passion for Onassis her undoing, or was it simply part of her truth, as essential as her music? Some argue that she wasted herself on a man unworthy of her, that she sacrificed her career for an illusion. Others suggest that her love was not weakness but a reflection of the same intensity that defined her art. She could not love halfway any more than she could sing halfway. To demand that she live more cautiously is to misunderstand her entirely. For Callas, life itself was an aria, and every aria must be sung to its limit, even if the voice breaks in the attempt. One imagines her legacy not as a crown placed neatly upon her head, but as a question suspended in the air, unanswered. Was she divine, or was she doomed? Was her story one of glory, or one of sorrow? The answer depends on the listener, on what one hears in her voice, on what one feels in her story. For some, she is eternal proof of the power of art to transcend death. For others, she is a warning of the dangers of passion unchecked. But for most, she is simply unforgettable, a figure who cannot be ignored, who demands a response even in silence. Her ashes rest in the Aegean, scattered into waters that are both gentle and restless. The waves carry her endlessly, mingling her with the salt and the wind, erasing the boundaries of her life and folding her into eternity. There is something fitting in this. She who belonged to no single place, Greek by birth, American by upbringing, Italian by art, Parisian by death, belongs now to the sea, to the world, to memory. The sea carries no judgment, no gossip, no comparison. It simply carries her onward, its tide eternal, its horizon endless. And so, we return to the silence, to the unresolved question. The record no longer spins. The candle no longer burns. The photograph remains face down. Maria Callas is gone, yet she is here, in every note that survives, in every whisper of her name, in every listener who closes their eyes and lets her voice carry them. Was she triumph or tragedy? Was she angel or flame? Was she divine or simply human? The silence does not answer. It waits like an open stage before the curtain rises, like a question posed to the listener, and perhaps that is as it should be. For in the end, the greatest legacy of Maria Callas is not certainty but ambiguity, not resolution but resonance. She remains always between extremes, between applause and silence, between love and abandonment, between genius and despair. And as we leave her story, let us hear not the closing of a curtain, but the faint sound of her voice rising once more, carried on the air like a ghost, fading into silence, yet refusing to vanish. It lingers, unresolved, as if waiting for us to decide, or to accept that no decision is possible.